2:14 in the morning, 48th floor. Claire Ashton sat perfectly still in her leather chair, eyes closed, breathing slow, and even every inch of her performing sleep she did not feel. The bankruptcy filing lay spread open across her desk, 47 pages of legal language that would erase everything she had spent 23 years building. 7 hours from now, she would sign it. But tonight, she was not grieving. She was watching. The door eased open. Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart inside, moving quiet and careful the way men do when they believe the room belongs to someone else. Claire did not twitch. She needed to know one thing only. What does a man do when he thinks no one is watching? Marcus stopped the moment his eyes caught the monitor, and what he saw on that screen had nothing to do with his mop or his cart. What does a janitor do with information that could save a billion-dollar company? Subscribe and stay right here because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who matters in a room. 5 years before he pushed a cleaning cart through the 48th floor of Vantage Capital's building, Marcus Webb had been the kind of man who wore a suit to work and argued with people who held MBAs and did not want to hear what the numbers were telling them. He had been a senior risk analyst at Meridian Bank, a mid-size financial institution headquartered in downtown Chicago. Marcus was good at his job, methodical, precise, and deeply uncomfortable with the gap between what the data said and what his supervisors wanted to believe. For 11 months, he had quietly built a case, a careful and obsessively documented analysis of the volatility exposure buried inside Meridian's derivative bond portfolio. The risk was real, the timeline was short, and the report he submitted to his division head on a Tuesday morning October was 62 pages long, with footnotes. His division head buried it, not because the numbers were wrong, because they were right, and accepting them would have required unwinding a position generating significant quarterly bonuses for people far above Marcus's pay grade. He was told his methodology needed revisiting. He was told his assumptions were too conservative. 6 months later, the bank collapsed exactly the way his report had projected. 300 jobs went with it, including his. His name appeared in 2 financial press articles, not as a whistleblower, not as the man who had tried to stop it, but as a former analyst at the failed institution. One of dozens let go in the restructuring. Nobody called to ask what he had tried to do. He spent 14 months looking for work in his field. The problem was not his resume. The problem was a word that moved quietly through the industry. Difficult. Hard to manage. It was never said directly. It did not need to be. His wife, Rachel, had held them together through the worst of it, working double shifts at the hospital, covering rent, cooking dinner at 10 at night, and never once making him feel small for needing her to. She was 34 when a driver ran a red light on Michigan Avenue and changed everything. Danny was 3. Marcus packed up their apartment, moved into a smaller one 6 blocks away, and made a decision. He would take whatever work let him be home when his daughter needed him. The night shift at Vantage Capital's building started at 10 in the evening and ended at 6 in the morning, which meant he could sleep until noon and be at Donnie's school by 3. He had been doing it for 3 years. Nobody on the 48th floor knew his name. Claire Ashton had built Vantage Capital from a desk in her father's spare bedroom at 28, using a $50,000 loan she had spent 4 months convincing him to give her. By 35, the fund managed $200 million. By 40, $900 million. She had never hired anyone she did not personally trust, a habit that had been both her greatest strength and her most catastrophic blind spot. 14 months ago, the losses had started. 3 major enterprise clients had walked, citing a competitor called Crestline Partners, whose proposals matched Vantage's strategies so precisely that coincidence was not a plausible explanation. She had hired 2 independent auditing firms. Both came back clean. 3 days ago, the board had placed a bankruptcy filing on her desk. That morning, before anyone arrived, she had opened the internal access dashboard and found it. A login at 1:47 in the morning under the account of Derek Hollis, her CFO, a man in Miami at a conference since Wednesday, whose keycard had not registered building entry since Tuesday afternoon. She had not called IT. She had pulled up the live access log on her monitor, turned off the office camera with the manual override behind her desk, and settled into her chair to wait. Marcus Webb had a system. Every floor took exactly 40 minutes if he worked without stopping. Carpets vacuumed in overlapping rows, glass surfaces wiped in single strokes, trash bins emptied and relined, restrooms restocked. He had done it so many times that the routine lived in his hands rather than his head, and he could move through an entire floor in a kind of focused quiet that some people might have mistaken for peace. He was not at peace. He was simply disciplined about the things he allowed himself to feel while working, and grief had not been on that list for 3 years. He pushed the cart through the 48th floor corridor, the way he always did past the dark offices with their sleeping monitors and empty chairs, until he reached the corner office at the end of the hall. The light was on, dim but on. He eased the door open, expecting a forgotten desk lamp. Instead, he found a woman in a dark blazer slumped in a leather chair, eyes closed, one hand resting on a thick stack of documents, her face arranged into an expression of exhausted stillness that he recognized from a long time ago, from the months after Rachel died, when he had worn the same expression in mirrors he eventually stopped looking into. He moved slowly. He clicked off the overhead lights, leaving only the small lamp on the corner of the desk. Then, because it was cold and because the woman had nothing covering her and because some things are simply reflexive in people raised a certain way, he lifted the blazer draped over the side chair and laid it gently across her shoulders. He turned toward the monitor to orient himself in the room and stopped. He had spent 11 years reading access logs. The format was industry standard: timestamp, username, file identifier, action type, transfer size. He had read thousands of them, and what was scrolling across the screen in real time was not a routine system record. The pattern was wrong in a way he identified in approximately 30 seconds. Bulk downloads, off hours, consistent timing spread across several weeks, all originating from a single high-clearance account, all targeting documents whose file identifiers marked them as strategic planning materials, the kind of files you pulled when you were preparing to bid against someone. He had written his graduate thesis on exactly this architecture. He knew it the way a doctor knows a familiar pathology presenting through a different set of symptoms, immediately, and with a certainty that settled in the chest rather than the head. He looked around the room. Only the sound of the woman breathing steadily in her chair. No camera light on the wall panel. Nobody watching. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it steady and photographed every line on that screen, every entry, every timestamp, every file name, every account identifier, working quickly and without hesitation until he had captured the entire visible log. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket, set the mop upright against the cart, and pushed it quietly out of the room without touching another surface. Behind him, Claire Ashton lay perfectly still. She had heard the faint click of the camera shutter. She had felt the weight of the blazer across her shoulders before that. She had counted his footsteps retreating toward the elevator and listened to the service elevator chime 2 floors down, and for the first time in 14 months, something other than the specific, familiar cold dread of watching her company die was moving through her chest. She did not know who he was. She did not know what he would do. But he had seen it, the same thing she had seen on that screen, and he had not looked away from it, and he had not kept walking. In the arithmetic of that night, that was everything. In the basement maintenance room, Marcus sat on a metal bench and looked at his phone. 23 frames, every line legible. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had not called in 4 years. Greg Nolan had been his closest colleague at a data security firm in Virginia, where Marcus had worked in the years before Meridian. Greg had gone on to build a career in digital forensics at a private firm in Washington that did contract work for financial regulators and occasionally for the federal government. They had not spoken since Marcus left the industry. Marcus was not certain Greg would even pick up at this hour. Greg answered on the 4th ring. voice thick with sleep, and listened without interrupting, while Marcus described what he had seen and what he needed, confirmation that the pattern in the access logs was what he thought it was, or honest evidence that he was reading something incorrectly. Greg said, "Send them." 12 minutes later, his phone rang again. Greg's voice was fully awake now, deliberate and careful in the way it got when he was reporting findings, rather than having a conversation. What Marcus had photographed was textbook corporate data exfiltration. The download pattern, bulk volume, off-hours timing, high clearance account, documents, concentrated in strategic planning categories, was not the signature of an internal audit or a routine backup procedure. It was the signature of someone methodically harvesting competitive intelligence across an extended period. The timestamps were too consistent to be accidental, and too spread across weeks to be any kind of system error. Someone had done this carefully, repeatedly, and with a precise understanding of which files would matter to a competitor. Greg said an operation of this scale, particularly if it touched a federal contract, fell squarely under FBI jurisdiction. He told Marcus to be careful. Then the line went dead. Marcus sat in the basement with the phone in his hands and worked through what he was actually weighing, clearly and without self-deception. He knew the argument for walking away. He was not supposed to be reading a CEO's security dashboard. He had photographed data he had no authorization to photograph on a personal device in the middle of the night. If this went wrong, if the evidence was contested, if Vantage's legal team decided to protect the institution by reframing the narrative, he would not be seen as a man who had tried to help. He would be seen as the man in the blue coveralls who had accessed confidential systems and taken unauthorized photographs. He could lose his job. He could face criminal charges. The small and carefully constructed life he had built around Danny's school schedule, the routine that was the only reliable structure holding the two of them together, could come apart completely. He knew the other side as well. He had spent 3 years telling himself that quiet was safe and that safety was enough. He had spent 3 years being invisible in a building full of people making consequential decisions with incomplete information, and he had told himself that was not his responsibility anymore. He had earned the right to that position. Life had extracted the price for it. He did not owe anyone on the 48th floor anything. All of that was true. Also true, the woman in that chair was not failing because she had made bad decisions. She was failing because someone she trusted was bleeding her company dry in the dark, and she was hours away from signing away everything she had built based on a picture of her company that had been deliberately falsified. He was the only person in the building who knew it. He could not have said, with any honesty, that the thing inside him which recognized that fact was the same thing that had kept him invisible for 3 years. He opened the FBI's online tip portal, uploaded the 12 clearest photographs, typed a factual description of what the log showed, the account name, the file categories, the approximate timeline, the pattern characteristics, and submitted it without including his own name. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. 2 days later, Marcus was called to the building management office on the 3rd floor. He walked in to find Ray Kowalski, the head of building security, standing behind the desk with his arms folded and a particular expression on his face, the expression of a man who has already decided how a conversation will end before it begins and is simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion. A USB drive containing client financial data had been reported missing from the 32nd floor. It had been found in the lower compartment of Marcus's cleaning cart. Marcus looked at his cart in the corner, the one with the yellow handle he had replaced himself 2 months ago when the original cracked. He looked at Kowalski, who was already reciting the part about the police being notified, his tone carrying the patient certainty of someone running a script they had rehearsed and found effective before. 2 other men were in the room, one in a building management polo shirt, one Marcus did not recognize, neither of them looking at anything directly. Marcus noted the timeline with the methodical calm of someone who had learned, at significant personal cost, not to let visible emotion become the loudest thing in a room. His cart had been in the locked equipment room from 6 in the morning until 9:45 the previous evening, when he retrieved it for his shift. He did not have a key to the 32nd floor supply corridor where the USB had reportedly gone missing. His shift had started after the time the USB was reported missing. These were real facts. They were provable facts, but in a room with 3 men and one prearranged narrative, his facts were going to carry a different weight than their story, and all 3 men in the room knew it, and at least one of them had counted on it. He stood straight and kept his voice level and said nothing about the timeline. He understood that explaining himself to Kowalski was not the path that led anywhere useful. Kowalski said, in a tone he had clearly used in similar rooms before, "I think you understand the seriousness of what we're looking at here." Marcus looked at him and waited. 2 floors up, Claire Ashton's assistant knocked on her office door midway through a conference call and told her there was a situation with a member of the cleaning crew on 3. Claire ended the call without explanation, took the elevator down, and walked into the management office to find Marcus standing in the center of the room, while Kowalski and the 2 other men arranged themselves around him in the casual geometry of people who believe the outcome has already been determined. She took in the room in 3 seconds. The positions of the bodies, the angle of Kowalski's desk, the particular expression of rehearsed concern on Kowalski's face present, calibrated, not reaching his eyes. She understood immediately what she was looking at. This was not a theft investigation. This was a coordinated message sent by someone who had decided that Marcus Webb was standing too close to a problem they needed to remain unsolved, and who had reached for the oldest and most reliable instrument available to them. The ambient assumption that a man in a blue coverall in a room full of men in collared shirts does not get the benefit of the doubt. She turned to Kowalski and told him his employment was terminated, effective immediately. She told the responding officer there had been an administrative error and that no charges would be filed. Then she walked out without looking at Marcus again, not because she was indifferent to what had just been done to him, but because she understood that he already knew precisely what it was, and he did not need her to perform an explanation for his benefit. He needed her to handle it. She had handled it. What she could not give back was the specific, familiar exhaustion of a man who has stood in that particular arrangement of bodies before, who knows the weight of a room that is already decided and has learned to hold himself upright inside it without letting it show on his face. That was not something she could address in a hallway. She was not sure it was something she could address at all. That evening, at 11:15, Claire found Marcus on the 39th floor, pushing the cart down a corridor of dark offices. She was not wearing her blazer. She had left her phone on her desk. She had not brought her assistant or told anyone where she was going. She walked the length of the corridor until she found the emergency stairwell landing near the east elevator bank, sat down on the bottom step, and waited. When Marcus came around the corner with the cart, he saw her there, sitting on the floor in the clothes she had been wearing since morning, looking not like a CEO conducting a private meeting, but like a person who had run out of places to be and had chosen a stairwell out of a process of elimination. He stopped the cart and set the brake. She told him she had been awake that night. She said she had heard the camera shutter. She had felt the weight of the blazer across her shoulders before he photographed anything, and she had lain still and counted his footsteps retreating toward the elevator, because she had not known, in those moments, whether the sound she had heard was someone trying to help her or someone trying to harm her further, and she had needed to be certain before she moved. She had been certain by the time the elevator chimed. She asked him, without any framing or apology, what he had done with what he had seen. Marcus leaned against the wall across from her, his hands at his sides, and was quiet for a moment, not hesitating but measuring, taking the weight of the question the way he took the weight of most things, by holding it for a second before responding. Then he said he had contacted someone he trusted, a person with the technical background to evaluate what the log pattern showed. That person had confirmed what he had suspected. The pattern was consistent with deliberate, sustained data exfiltration. He had not yet sent the photographs to any official authority. Claire asked why not. He looked at her for a moment. He said he had not sent them because he had not yet determined who, in this building, could be trusted with them. She heard that and said nothing for 10 full seconds. Not because it stung, though it did, precisely and cleanly, in the way that accurate things tend to, but because there was no honest response available to her that would improve on his silence. She had spent 14 months inside a company she had built, surrounded by people she had hired and trusted, and compensated well, and she had not been able to name who was destroying her. She had no standing to call his caution excessive. She had no argument to make against it. It was the correct position, arrived at by the correct method, and the fact that it implicated her as much as it implicated anyone else was simply part of what was true. She said, "Then I suppose you know now." He looked at her the way people look at each other late at night in empty hallways, when the performances they wear during business hours have simply become too heavy to keep on, not at her title, not at the floor number, not at the figure that appeared next to the company name in the financial press. He looked at her as a person in a difficult situation trying to find a way through it, which was all that either of them actually was at 11:15 on a weeknight in a stairwell. He asked what she wanted him to do. She said she could get him access to the complete internal financial records for the past 30 months, transferred to a physical drive with no network trail. She asked if he would look at them. He asked if she wanted his honest assessment, even if it reflected poorly on her own decisions. She said yes, in the tone of someone who knows the difference between meaning that and not meaning it. He said all right. Marcus spent the next 3 nights in the first-floor cafeteria after his shift ended, working through the documents Claire had transferred to a physical USB drive. No network connection, no email, no record of transmission between them. He arrived at 1 in the morning and stayed until 4, sitting under fluorescent lights at a corner table with printed pages and a cup of machine coffee. The cafeteria's motion sensors cycled the lights off after 12 minutes of stillness, so every 11 minutes he stood up, walked to the machine and back, and sat down again, a rhythm he did not mind. Claire had given him everything. Internal fund accounting records for 30 months, capital allocation reports by quarter, transaction logs for all 3 sub-funds, fee schedules, client correspondence, organized by date. He built a timeline from the ground up, cross-referencing dates against the client departure records, working without a conclusion in mind, and following only what the data showed him. The pattern emerged on the 2nd night. By the 3rd night, he had confirmed it with enough documentation to make it unambiguous and enough cross-referencing to make it resistant to the kind of alternative explanations a good defense attorney would reach for first. Derek Hollis had not simply been leaking strategy documents to Crestline partners. What he had done was considerably more sophisticated. Over approximately 26 months, he had been redistributing capital between Vantage's 3 sub-funds through a series of small, staggered transactions, each individually below the threshold that would trigger an automated compliance alert, each explainable in isolation as routine rebalancing activity, each contributing to a cumulative pattern that had made Vantage's flagship fund appear dramatically undercapitalized relative to its actual asset holdings. Marcus recognized the technique because he had written about it 8 years earlier at the University of Chicago. It was called layering, a method borrowed from money laundering practice and adapted for internal corporate fraud, designed specifically to be invisible to automated monitoring systems and to audit teams working from standard compliance checklists. It required patience, financial sophistication, and an intimate familiarity with the target organization's internal alert parameters. It was not opportunistic. It was architectural. It was the work of someone who had planned the outcome well before the first transaction and had constructed the entire sequence backward from the result they intended to produce. Hollis had not been trying to steal from Vantage. He had been building the conditions for a distressed acquisition, manufacturing the appearance of insolvency while the real assets remained largely intact, setting the stage for a buyer, almost certainly Crestline Partners, or an entity connected to them, to move in at a fraction of the company's genuine value. Claire would have signed the bankruptcy filing this morning and believed she was signing because her company had failed. She would have been wrong. Her company had been made to look like it had failed by the person she trusted most to tell her the truth about its health. On the morning after the third night, before the building filled up, Marcus printed the complete analysis, organized it by category and date, and left it on Claire's desk with a handwritten note clipped to the top page. Pages 4, 11, and 23. This is not accounting error. This is intentional, and your company is not dead. Claire read it at 6:45 in the morning with her door locked and the lights still off, still in the coat she had worn in from the street. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for 15 minutes and let the full shape of what had been done to her come into focus without rushing it. Derek Hollis had been with her for 9 years. He had been present at every crisis the company had faced. She had trusted him more completely than almost anyone in her professional life. She understood now that what she had read as loyalty had been a performance, and that the man who had sat across from her after her father's funeral, saying the right things, had already been running the clock on her for over 2 years. She picked up her personal phone and called her private attorney. When Richard Ames opened the emergency board session 2 mornings later, the atmosphere in the glass-walled conference room carried the specific gravity of a decision everyone present believed had already been made. The bankruptcy filing sat centered on the table. The yellow signature tabs were flagged and waiting. The board members had their folders open. Hollis was 2 chairs to Claire's left in a charcoal suit, hands folded on the table, his expression a carefully composed performance of regret and professionalism, the face of a man who has accepted a painful outcome and is prepared to help manage the aftermath with grace. Claire opened her laptop and connected it to the wall display. She said she needed to walk through something before the session formally proceeded. What appeared on the screen was not the bankruptcy filing. It was a 30-page transaction analysis organized by date, fund identifier, and account code. Claire narrated the first 3 pages without commentary dates, figures, transfer amounts, the specific identifiers of the files accessed, and the account that had accessed them. She let the numbers speak for approximately 4 minutes before she said the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. Every transaction in this document originates from a single account. That account belongs to our chief financial officer. Hollis did not move immediately. He allowed 2 full seconds to pass before he responded 1 second too long for a man who had nothing to conceal. Then he leaned forward and asked, his voice carrying a fraction less of its usual smoothness, who had prepared the analysis and under whose authority. Claire said, "The night shift janitor on the 48th floor." The room went silent in the specific way rooms do when something happens that nobody was positioned to absorb. Not the polite silence of a meeting waiting for the next agenda item, but the airless, recalibrating stillness of people simultaneously processing something they had no framework for. Hollis looked around the table for someone whose expression would match his own and found no one looking back at him. Richard Ames had pulled the first pages of the analysis across the table and was reading them carefully, his finger moving down the columns of figures. 2 of the other board members had done the same. The moment Hollis understood that he had lost the room was not the moment he was accused. It was the moment not a single person turned to look at him for reassurance. He tried once more. He said the document's provenance needed to be established before the board could be expected to treat it seriously. He said the claim required independent verification. He said there were significant questions about the methodology and the qualifications of whoever had produced it. Each of these was a reasonable argument in a different kind of room. In this room, with these faces, at this moment, they landed with the particular hollowness of arguments that everyone present has already decided not to find convincing. What happened next had not been arranged by Claire, because she had not known it was coming. The conference room door opened. A woman in a dark navy suit stepped inside, followed by 2 men in identical suits. She identified herself as Special Agent Lauren Cross, of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and stated that they were present to execute a search warrant on the digital accounts and office of Derek Hollis, Chief Financial Officer of Vantage Capital, in connection with an ongoing investigation into corporate espionage and the theft of trade secrets. Hollis turned to Claire. His voice had lost its architecture entirely. He said, "What is this?" Claire met his eyes. She said nothing. Hollis was escorted from the conference room. The door closed behind him. The room held its breath for a moment that no one seemed willing to break. The bankruptcy filing remained on the table, unsigned, its yellow tabs still neatly folded. Richard Ames set the analysis pages down, looked across the table at Claire, and asked in a quiet voice whether she had known the FBI was coming. She said she had known something was wrong. She had not known when the door would open. Both of those things, she told him, were entirely true. Within 72 hours of Hollis's removal, the world outside Vantage Capital's walls had learned enough to be dangerous. Financial press coverage of the FBI search and the CFO's suspension sent the company's institutional reputation into freefall. Two of Vantage's remaining major investment partners had placed their capital allocations under formal review, which in practical terms meant they were preparing to exit. A third had asked for an emergency call that had not yet been scheduled. The stabilization plan Claire's legal and financial advisors assembled was conventional and inadequate. It managed the reputational dimension without addressing the structural question whether Vantage's core assets were genuinely viable once the manufactured insolvency Hollis had constructed was stripped away. The advisors in the conference room were experienced, well-credentialed people who had handled corporate crises before. None of them had spent 3 nights reading every document in Vantage's portfolio with the specific intention of finding what was still alive inside it. Marcus was on the 37th floor, running the vacuum along the baseboards in the last corridor of his route, when Claire came around the corner at 11:40 at night, still in the clothes she had been wearing since 7 in the morning. She did not have her phone. She sat down against the wall near the elevator bank without explaining herself and looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has been in too many rooms full of people saying things that do not help. Marcus turned off the vacuum. He waited. She asked him, without framing or preamble, what he would do if he were her. He leaned against the opposite wall and thought about it without performing the thinking. He had not been waiting for this question, but he had been carrying the answer to it for 3 days because the data had made it visible, and he had not been able to look away from it any more than he had been able to look away from the access log 2 weeks earlier. He walked her through it. 3 subfunds. The first was genuinely compromised, too entangled with Hollis's transactions to be cleanly separated, without triggering regulatory scrutiny that would consume months the company did not have. But the second and third were different. Hollis had used them as pass-through vehicles rather than primary targets, which meant their underlying assets were largely intact. If those 2 funds were legally separated from the first and rechartered as independent vehicles under Vantage's umbrella, their combined capital position was sufficient to sustain the company's 2 largest remaining partnerships. Not comfortably, but sufficiently, if the case was made honestly to the right people within the next 48 hours. He had seen this in the data. The company was not what the bankruptcy filing described. That document had been drafted against a picture of Vantage that existed only inside Hollis's constructed numbers. The real assets, the real relationships, the intellectual property that had generated $900 million in managed capital, all of it was still there, underneath a fraud designed to look like a natural collapse. He finished talking. Claire looked at him for a moment in the particular silence of someone who has been told something true after a long period of being told things that were carefully constructed not to be. She said, "Come with me." She walked him to the 48th floor, into the conference room where the unsigned bankruptcy filing was still sitting on the table because no one had thought to remove it. She opened the door, stood at the head of the table, and told the 4 advisors still present that they were going to hear a proposal. One of the advisors, gray suit, reading glasses, the expression of a man whose patience had been running on institutional goodwill for several hours, looked past Claire at the figure in the blue coveralls, standing in the doorway, and asked who he was. Marcus stepped inside. He did not look at the floor. He looked at the man who had asked and said, evenly, "I am the only person in this building who has read all of your documents." The restructuring proposal was adopted within 48 hours. The legal separation of the second and third sub-funds moved faster than any of the advisors had believed possible, primarily because Marcus had already worked out the full documentation pathway required to execute it and had written it out, in his careful handwriting, on 3 pages of cafeteria paper that Claire had found paper-clipped to the back of the transaction analysis. The 2 investment partners who had placed their allocations under review were presented with the restructured proposal on a Thursday afternoon. Both agreed, by the following Monday, to maintain their capital commitments. The SEC confirmed that Claire had cooperated fully and transparently with the federal investigation. Hollis's exposure was personal and criminal. Within a month, Crestline Partners had lost its federal contract, standing pending an investigation into procurement fraud based on stolen intelligence. 2 of the 3 enterprise clients who had originally departed reached out to reopen conversations. Vantage Capital did not recover overnight. There were debts to restructure and a significant gap in the executive leadership to fill carefully and without haste. But the freefall had stopped. The company was standing. For the first time in over a year, Claire could look at the company's future without seeing a cliff. 3 weeks after the board session, Claire went looking for Marcus. She found him in the basement equipment room on a Tuesday evening, organizing cleaning supplies on a metal shelf with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. She had asked building security where to find him, and the guard on duty had given her a look of mild confusion, as though the question itself were slightly unusual, which told her something she filed away without commenting on. She stood in the doorway and told him she knew what he had done. She said she had been awake that first night, that she had understood what she was hearing when he stopped cleaning and started looking, and that she had spent the weeks since then thinking about what it meant that the person who had stepped forward when her company was dying had been the person her institution had designed itself to make invisible. Marcus listened. When she finished, he said, "I did not do it for the company." She asked what he meant. He looked at the shelf of supplies beside him, then back at her. He said he had done it because he used to be someone who understood those systems, and when he saw what was on the screen, pretending not to understand would have been a different kind of lie than the ones he was already telling himself. He had spent 3 years making himself small because it felt like the only way to protect what he had left. That night in her office, alone, with no one watching and nothing to gain, he had found out whether the person he used to be was still in there somewhere. He said it turned out he was. Claire offered him the position, risk strategy consultant, formal contract, salary, an office on the 12th floor, a mandate to build the internal monitoring infrastructure that would ensure what Hollis had done could never go undetected again. Marcus asked whether she was offering it because he was qualified or because she felt she owed him something. She said, "Both. But the first reason is sufficient to sign the contract. The second one belongs to me." He accepted. 1 year later, on a Friday afternoon in November, Danny Webb stood at the window of her father's office on the 12th floor and watched downtown Chicago below with the attention of a 10-year-old who had decided that tall buildings were interesting for the same reason. Mountains were because of what they implied about the smallness of everything at their base. She turned and asked her father if he liked working there. Marcus put down his pen. He said, Donnie asked, "Why?" He said, "Because back then I did not need anyone's permission to know what I was worth." Danny considered this with the focused expression she wore when deciding whether something was true or just something adults said. She appeared to conclude it was true. She turned back to the window. In the corridor outside, Claire walked past the half-open office door carrying a folder. She had not planned to stop, but she heard the words through the gap and she did stop for a moment only, not entering, simply standing with the folder in her hands and letting the sentence land where it needed to. The expression on her face was not guilt. It was something quieter, the expression of a person who has spent years looking at the world through a particular lens and has recently begun to understand that the lens was ground incorrectly. Not with malice, simply incorrectly. She had built systems to measure the people around her, and those systems had not been calibrated to register what turned out to matter most. She walked on. Marcus locked his office, took Danny's hand, and they walked to the elevator together. Danny narrating something about a classmate who had decided fractions were philosophically unjust and submitted a formal complaint to the principal, which Danny found admirable but strategically questionable. The elevator arrived. As the doors began to close, Donnie looked up and asked, "Do you have a friend here yet?" Marcus looked down at her. He thought about a woman who had sat on a stairwell floor at 11 at night and asked him honestly what he would do. He thought about being walked into a room full of people who had already arrived at their conclusion and hearing someone say only, "Listen to him." He smiled, the first one in a long time that required no effort. He said, "I think maybe one." The doors closed. The building continued its work around them in the early dark of a Chicago November, and somewhere below, in a basement room where one necessary thing had happened and no one would ever mark it, the lights were on and ordinary and empty.